Hello everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. Asterisk, the first night at the summer camp began with a light rain, the moisture seeping into the old wooden cracks of the makeshift boarding house built in the forest. The high school students gathered around the campfire, holding small flashlights, the flickering light shining on their young and eager faces. In that group was John, a tall and skinny boy who was always curious about ghost legends. The guide said that this forest had many mysterious deaths, especially around the dry lake behind the camp. The night was dark. The chirping of crickets seemed to accompany the spooky atmosphere. When the fire gradually died down, John and a few friends decided to go check out the abandoned warehouse. They only had flashlights to guide them. Each step on the wet ground seemed to echo in the endless space. The warehouse door made a creepy screech when pushed open. The musty smell rushed straight into everyone's nose, making everyone shiver. Inside was pitch black. Only the small beams of flashlights passed through the old, cobwebbed objects. The air was thick, as if it was holding something that never wanted to be awakened. Suddenly, Sarah screamed as her flashlight stopped at the corner of the room. Everyone turned around, seeing a tall figure, faint as mist, standing motionless. The figure did not move, but the light from the flashlight seemed to be sucked in, not reflected back. The group was silent, their hearts pounding. No one dared to breathe loudly. John stuttered, "Is anyone there?" But the only response was the sound of wind blowing through the rusty metal roof and a cold, creepy silence. Suddenly, the figure took a step forward. The sound of wood creaking on the floor made everyone retreat. The flashlight flickered, the light dancing as if it was about to go out. Sarah trembled, her hand tightly grasping John's, her voice whispering as she begged to leave this place. But John was drawn in, his eyes fixed on that strange figure. It was taller than anyone else in the group. Its eyes were empty like a deep hole. The flashlight light just touched it and disappeared as if swallowed. A chill ran down his spine, but his curiosity still urged him to take another step forward. At that moment, the figure disappeared, so fast that everyone thought they were seeing things. But the musty smell was stronger, and a soft laugh rang out from the darkness, thin but full of irony. The flashlight in John's hand shook. The light swerved wildly, illuminating the wall with countless mottled handprints, as if someone had just printed them with wet mud. Sarah burst into tears, and the others ran out in all directions, leaving John standing there, not yet able to recover. John ran to the door, but found the darkness outside unusually thick. The sound of insects suddenly stopped, replaced by a wheezing sound right behind him. When he turned back, the space behind him was only an empty darkness, but the cold still wrapped around his neck. John shouted in panic to call everyone, but the only response was a long echo and laughter from afar. The flashlight flashed continuously. Each time it lit up, it would reveal a figure passing by, standing behind the pillar, then disappearing. He rushed out of the warehouse, his feet stumbling on the wet ground. It was raining heavily. Each drop falling to the ground sounded like a ghostly drum. In the distance, the campfire had gone out. The whole camp was strangely silent, only John's heart pounding in his chest. When he turned his head back, in the white rain, he clearly saw a figure standing right at the door of the warehouse, motionless, but the head tilted at a strange angle as if watching him. John trembled, trying to convince himself that it was just an illusion caused by fatigue. But each heavy step behind him made him freeze. The figures slowly approached, each step echoing as if stepping straight into his heart. John held the flashlight tightly, the shaky light shining straight into the void. And this time he saw the eyes clearly, black, deep as a bottomless abyss. A loud thunderclap. The light flashed, brightening the scene for a moment. And when darkness returned, the figure had disappeared. John panicked and ran back to the dormitory where the others were huddled together, shivering. But the fear had not just begun, but had opened the door to more terrible things in the following nights of this haunted summer camp. The story continued, and those shadows would not stop at the first night. In the cramped room, the dim light from a few flashlights was not enough to dispel the surrounding cold. John shivered as he recounted what he had just seen in the warehouse, but no one dared to believe it was all real. Sarah sat huddled in the corner of the bed, her eyes red, whispering that she had heard a ghostly laugh right next to her ear as she ran away. The rest of the group could only stay silent, cold sweat dripping down their foreheads despite the cold wind and rain outside. The heavy atmosphere made the group feel like they were trapped in an invisible cage. The camp guide, Mr. Miller, heard the noise and stepped in. The oil lamp he held in his hand clearly illuminated the children's worried faces. John quickly stood up and recounted everything that had happened in the warehouse, from the blurry figure to the eyes as black as a deep abyss. Mr. Miller shook his head, thinking it was just a trick of the dark combined with an overactive imagination. But his voice lacked certainty. His eyes flashed with tension that the children all recognized. That night, no one slept. The sound of the wind whistling through the wooden door, the sound of rain hitting the rusty metal roof, and the unusually silent sound of insects created a terrifying soundtrack. John held the flashlight tightly, the light reflecting on the ceiling, creating moving shadows. Sarah lay close to the wall, tears still flowing non-stop. Occasionally, the group would be startled by the sound of footsteps rustling in the hallway. But when they opened the door, they would only see pitch-black darkness. Around midnight, when everyone was just dozing off, a loud noise came from the warehouse, as if someone had slammed the door. John jumped up, his heart aching. He looked out the window, saw in the thick rain, lightning illuminating a long, motionless figure, its head tilted unnaturally. Sarah screamed loudly, causing the group to jump up, huddled closer together, everyone holding their breath, waiting. But when the thunder flashed again, the figure had disappeared. John felt compelled to return to the warehouse, partly out of morbid curiosity, partly out of the fear that if they didn't confront it, the shadow would haunt them all summer. He spoke his mind, but everyone strongly objected. Sarah grabbed John's hand, begging him not to go. However, John's determined gaze made her speechless. Finally, Tom, his best friend, decided to follow John, because he couldn't leave his friend alone in this scary rainy night. The two of them silently took their flashlights, opened the door, and stepped outside. The sound of rain pounding on the ground, the wind howling through the trees, and the pitch-black sky seemed to swallow all the light. The flashlight's light was as dim as a weak firefly in the night. John and Tom walked silently, their hearts pounding as if they were about to burst. As they approached the warehouse, a sudden cold wind blew through, carrying a strong, musty smell that made them suffocate. The warehouse door opened, creaking as if pulled by an invisible hand. It was dark inside, but this time it was no longer silent. From within the darkness came a continuous whisper, as if several people were talking at once, but the language was unclear. John raised his flashlight and shone it in the shaky light, sweeping across a row of broken wooden boards, over old chairs, and then stopping. On the wall, Countless handprints were clearly visible, as if mud, but they were still dripping water onto the floor. Tom stepped back in panic, while John stood still at that moment. Both of them heard slow footsteps from behind, even though the door was still open in front. They turned their heads and saw at the end of the dark hallway a figure approaching. Each heavy step echoed like dragging chains. The flashlight flickered, the light sometimes dimmed, sometimes brightened. As the figure got closer, John saw a blurry face, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just an opaque void. A chill ran through his body, rendering him unable to move. Tom shouted, pulling John out. They rushed through the door, but as soon as they reached the yard, they heard a ghostly laugh echoing behind them, cold as needles piercing their skin. For a moment, John turned back and saw the figure still standing in the warehouse, head tilted to one side, as if waiting for the next meeting. The second night at the haunted summer camp had just begun, and the terrifying secrets were only just beginning to be revealed. After escaping the warehouse, John and Tom returned to their room, soaked and still with racing hearts. The other children immediately gathered around, their eyes filled with confusion, demanding to know what had happened. John trembled as he told them about the faceless face, the handprints dripping on the wall, and the haunting laughter that surrounded them. The space in the small room was suffocating, his every word making everyone shiver. Sarah hugged the blanket tightly, her lips murmuring prayers, while Tom was still haunted, his eyes staring into the darkness at the window. Mr. Miller entered, saw the children panicking, frowned and shouted that it was all just imagination. But his voice trembled, his hand gripping the oil lamp handle, showing that he was also scared. John saw a glimpse of confusion in his eyes, a truth that could not be hidden. Perhaps he knew more than he was saying. That night, no one slept. The rain was still falling heavily, mixed with the wind howling through the trees like a distant groan. Occasionally, slow footsteps echoed down the hallway, but when the door opened, there was no one there. Sarah was so scared that she asked to change rooms, but everyone knew that there was no safe place in this summer camp. The flashlight beam swept across the ceiling, creating long, winding shadows, like dozens of arms reaching down as dawn approached. John fell asleep tiredly, but in his dream, he saw himself standing in front of the warehouse again. The wooden door opened, and from the darkness, a faceless figure stepped out, head tilted, holding out an empty hand toward him. John screamed, jerking himself out of bed, sweat soaking the back of his shirt. He gasped, realizing that everyone around him was also awake. No one dared to close their eyes again. The next morning, the sky was still gloomy. Thick clouds covered it. The sunlight could not penetrate. The atmosphere of the summer camp was quiet. Everyone avoided mentioning what happened during the night. But the more the fear was suppressed, the heavier it became. Tom whispered to John that he had seen clearly when he turned round. The faceless face did not disappear, but was still standing in the warehouse as if waiting. John was silent, his heart aching with the feeling that everything was not over in the afternoon. When the group gathered to eat, a strange thing happened. Sarah's flashlight suddenly lit up, even though the battery had been dead since yesterday. The trembling light from it created a shadow on the wall, tall and distorted. Everyone panicked. Sarah threw the flashlight to the ground, but the light did not go out. It kept flickering as if someone was breathing right inside. John walked over, picked it up, and for a moment he saw the reflection of a pair of black eyes in the lens. Mr. Miller quickly snatched the flashlight and threw it out into the yard. He He shouted at everyone to be quiet, but his voice was broken, revealing his panic. John realizes that he is keeping secrets from the camp. He decides to find out the truth, even if it means facing his deepest fear. Tom agrees to go with him, while Sarah begs him not to take any more risks. But Mr. Miller's silence only makes them more suspicious. The third night is approaching. The creepy signs show that the ghost at the camp is not simply a hallucination. It is following each person, creeping through the light of flashlights, spreading inescapable terror. And then a sudden, eerie sound echoes from the deep woods, like the distant call of forgotten souls. The story does not end there, and the next night will bring more terrible hauntings than John could have ever imagined. The third night fell on the summer camp, with the sky overcast and the smell of damp earth after a long rain. No one had the excitement of the first days, but instead there was a tension like a broken string. John decided to go with Tom to find out Mr. Miller's secret, because they were both sure that he was hiding something. Sarah, trembling, still followed because she was afraid to be alone in the dark room. The flashlights were turned on, the weak light swaying. Each blink seemed to fan the anxiety in the group's hearts. The hallway was so quiet that the footsteps of the three people echoed like drums in the night. John noticed streaks on the wall like water stains, but when he brought the flashlight closer, they clearly showed the shape of long hands, overlapping each other. Tom immediately pulled him faster, and Sarah burst into tears, insisting that someone was walking right behind her. They stopped to listen, but the hallway was filled with the sound of the wind and the pounding of hearts. Finally, they found the small room at the end of the hall where Mr. Miller often went. The door was locked, but John noticed a faint light coming from inside. He leaned in, clearly hearing whispers, as if he were talking to someone. John knocked, but the whispers stopped immediately. There was a moment of silence, then the door opened, and Mr. Miller stood there with a pale face and a vacant look in his eyes. He shouted, telling the group to return to the room immediately, his voice hoarse and filled with fear. John refused to give up. He asked directly, what was the shadow in the warehouse? Mr. Miller trembled, his eyes lost, then closed the door tightly, without saying another word. Sarah cried out to leave this place, but Tom held John's hand tightly, whispering that they had to find out the truth themselves. Because, as time went on, something was getting closer, weighing down on each of them when they returned to their room. They found the flashlight Sarah had thrown the day before lying neatly on the table, even though they were sure it had been thrown out into the yard. Its light flickered like a candle in a storm, casting a faceless shadow tilted on the wall. Sarah screamed and fell to her knees, and John rushed forward and grabbed it. In that moment, he heard a clear whisper, "Give me back what is mine." His heart clenched, his hands trembled, but his eyes remained fixed on the deep black holes reflected in the light. Tonight, there were no more strange signs, but a real warning. The shadow did not just want to intimidate, it was demanding back something that had been taken away. John swallowed, realizing the terrifying truth. This summer camp was not accidentally haunted, but a place containing some unrevealed tragedy. And what they were facing was not just a vague human figure, but a persistent spirit, determined not to let go. Thunder boomed. Lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the forest, revealing a faceless figure standing in the middle of the yard. It was motionless, but its head tilted as if laughing. John dropped the flashlight, his throat constricting, and Sarah fainted. Tom screamed in despair, pulling his friends closer. They knew that tonight, the nightmare would not stop here. but would only get worse in the hours to come. The story was not over yet, and the next night would unfold the bloody truth about this haunted summer camp. It was late at night. The rain had not stopped yet, each heavy drop hitting the rusty, corrugated iron roof, creating a rapid sound like a drumbeat. John sat close to the window, his eyes tensely looking out at the dark yard. The faceless shadow he had seen earlier was still imprinted in his memory, making his whole body tremble. Tom sat beside him, tightly holding the wooden stick he had picked up, as if it could resist something supernatural. Sarah had just woken up from her fainting spell, her face pale, her lips stuttering, constantly repeating that someone was calling her name in her dream. The atmosphere was thick, suffocatingly silent. Suddenly, the flashlight John had dropped earlier lit up again, even though the battery was dead. The light was emitted, this time no longer reflecting the faceless shadow on the wall, but creating blurred words that seemed to be engraved into the air. Leave before it's too late. The three of them were stunned. No one dared to breathe heavily. Tom shook and grabbed the flashlight, but as soon as he touched it, the words disappeared, replaced by a sigh that echoed through the room, low and deep, as if coming from underground. Sarah burst into tears, begging to leave the camp, but John felt a strange pull. He believed that the spirit was not just trying to scare, but also wanted to tell him something. Death, a secret, or some betrayal that had happened here, all were buried. John was determined to find the truth, even though fear was tightening its grip on his throat. As the night passed, the group stayed awake for most of the night. Every time he closed his eyes, John saw the faceless face approaching, the black eye sockets fixed on him. Near dawn, a strange, long howl rang out from outside, not the sound of an animal, nor the sound of the wind. It was like the lost call of souls, echoing from the woods behind the lake. John knew for sure that was where the answer lay. The next day, as the weak sunlight filtered through the grey clouds, John persuaded Tom and Sarah to go with him to the lake. Mr. Miller absolutely forbade it. His eyes bloodshot, his voice hoarse, saying that the lake was dangerous and no one was allowed to go near it. But his excessive fear only made the group more suspicious. Tom struggled fiercely, but in the end he agreed to go with John because both of them were too deep in this vortex of horror. Sarah, despite her tears, could not bear to leave her friends alone. They sneaked out of the camp, following the path through the forest. The tall trees covered the sky. The dim light made the path seem like an endless dark tunnel. The sound of footsteps rustling on the carpet of dry leaves, accompanied by the howling wind, created a ghostly atmosphere. Every time they swung their flashlights, they saw vague figures appear in the forest, standing still and watching. Sarah clutched John's arm, her heart pounding, while Tom tightened his grip on the wooden stick in his hand as they approached the lake. A thick mist suddenly rose, covering the entire space. The lake water was as smooth as a mirror, but it reflected images that did not match reality. John shined his flashlight into the water and was stunned to see that it was not his own reflection, but the image of a faceless man standing right next to him. He quickly turned around, but there was no one. Sarah screamed, pointing down at the lake, where dozens of faceless figures were standing in a circle, their heads tilted, their black eyes looking straight at them. The group panicked and gradually retreated. The eerie laughter echoed across the lake, cold as needles piercing their flesh. At this moment, John understood that the secret of the summer camp and the lake was the key to everything. But the price to discover it would not be light. The story is not over yet. because the next night will reveal the ghosts imprisoned in the lake and the horrifying truth about this summer camp's past. The thick fog around the lake wrapped around the three children like a cold curtain. John held the flashlight tightly, the weak light falling on the water still reflecting dozens of faceless shadows standing silently in a circle. The eerie laughter suddenly echoed, making Sarah cry, and Tom tried to calm her down, but his voice was trembling. John realized that these spirits were not only present in the darkness, they had crept into dreams, whispers, even in everyday objects like flashlights, as they gradually retreated from the shore. A faceless shadow separated from the water, slowly walking up the shore. Water dripped from its body to the ground, each step making a heavy rustling sound. John and Tom dragged Sarah back into the forest, their hearts pounding wildly. But every time they swung the flashlight, they saw the faceless shadows standing right in front of them, then disappearing when the light flickered. The group seemed to be trapped in a maze of ghosts with no way out. After running for a long distance, they fell face down on the muddy dirt road. In a panic, John accidentally discovered an old stone tablet lying at the base of a tree. On the tablet were faintly engraved names that had faded over the years. Tom exclaimed in horror when he realized that many names matched the list of students who had gone missing at the summer camp many years ago. Sarah trembled, saying that her grandmother had told them about mysterious disappearances that no one dared to mention again at that moment. The atmosphere fell, eerily silent. The sound of insects disappeared, leaving only the rapid heartbeats of the three. From afar, faceless shadows appeared again, more this time, dozens of blurry figures slowly approaching them. John shined his flashlight, the shaky light touching the eyeless, mouthless faces. But each step exuded extreme hatred. They ran all the way back to the camp. Sweat and rain mixed together, breathing raggedly. When they opened the door to the room, the three were stunned. On the wall appeared a series of lines written in wet mud, stretching from the floor to the ceiling. The words were blurred but still legible. "We never rest in peace." Sarah fainted, Tom held his head in despair, and John's back was cold when he realized his suspicions were correct. Mr. Miller entered, his face pale when he saw the lines. This time, he no longer denied, but quietly admitted that the summer camp was built on the ground of an old camp that had burned down. Dozens of children had died that night, their souls forever imprisoned around the lake and the warehouse. He bowed his head, his voice trembling, saying that he himself was one of the only survivors, but carried the guilt for the rest of his life. John was stunned, his heart clenched. Those faceless figures were the forgotten souls, imprisoned in a never-ending nightmare. And now they were back for justice, to unleash their fury on anyone who dared to touch the cursed land. Outside, the wind howled fiercely. The door to the room swung open, and in a flash of lightning, a series of faceless figures stood in the middle of the courtyard, their heads tilted, their black holes piercing the living. The story did not end there, for the next night would be when the spirits would begin their relentless attack. The fourth night at camp passed in an eerie silence. No more insects, no more wind whistling through the trees. Just a stillness as if the forest were holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. John sat by the window, eyes wide open, unable to sleep. Outside, the rain-soaked yard was dark, but he knew that dozens of faceless spirits were still standing somewhere, watching the survivors' every breath. Tom sat close to John, his hands still clutching the wooden stick. He whispered that the truth about the fire was only the beginning, that something bigger was hidden. Sarah sat huddled in the corner of the room, her eyes red from crying. She heard strange voices echoing in her head, whispering her name in the darkness. Tonight, the spirits were no longer just appearing outside, but seemed to have crept into the room. Suddenly, the flashlight that had been left on the table turned on, shining brightly without anyone touching it. The light bounced off the ceiling, creating blurry, twisted shadows. Among them, John clearly saw the figure of a child, a burned face, a hand reaching out for help. He choked, unable to believe his eyes. Sarah screamed, and Tom panicked and threw the stick at the figure, but it only went through the air. The air in the room was thick with the smell of smoke, as if the fire from years ago was replaying. All three of them coughed, their eyes stinging, and then they heard sobbing coming from the four walls. The cries of children mixed with desperate screams, echoing terrifyingly. John trembled, understanding that the children who had died in the fire that year were trying to contact them. They were not demons, but souls trapped in pain and resentment. At that moment, the door to the room opened, and Mr. Miller rushed in, his face haggard, his eyes bloodshot. He shouted at the group to be quiet, but his voice was trembling. John pressed him, demanding that he tell the whole truth. Mr. Miller collapsed, sobbing, admitting that that year, when the fire broke out, the people in charge had abandoned the children to escape. He was the only one who survived, carrying the guilt for the rest of his life. The faceless souls were the victims, abandoned in the cruel fire. The confession stunned all three. Sarah screamed in despair. Tom held John's hand tightly, and John shed tears. He understood that the anger of the souls was not without reason, but at the same time, it also meant that they would not stop until all the survivors and descendants involved paid the price. Outside, lightning flashed, and this time it was not just the faceless figure standing in the middle of the yard. Dozens of burned faces, blurred by the fire, also appeared, gradually approaching the boarding house. The cries, the ghostly laughter, the screams mixed together, forming a terrifying soundtrack. John tightened his grip on the flashlight, knowing that tonight they would have to face the impatient spirits. The story was not over, because the next night would be the night the spirits rose strongly, bringing with them the most cruel judgment. That night, the room seemed to turn into hell as the sound of crying and eerie laughter echoed from every corner. John held the flashlight tightly, the light trembling as if it was about to go out, illuminating the smoke streaks floating around. Sarah fainted, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the bed, her mouth stammering, begging to leave. Tom tried to stay calm, but his eyes could not hide the fear, sweat pouring down his forehead. Mr. Miller sat down on the floor, as if he had lost all vitality, his eyes staring blankly into the darkness in front of him. Suddenly, the door to the room swung open. The wind rushed in, carrying a cold air that made all three children shiver. Outside, dozens of faceless souls quietly approached, but this time they did not just stand still. They tilted their heads in unison, their movements jerking like puppets with broken joints, then took each step closer to the row of houses. The sound of footsteps echoed in unison, the echoing sound making everyone's hearts feel like they were about to jump out of their chests. John quickly slammed the door shut, blocking it with a table and chair, but the pounding from outside immediately rang out. The pounding made the door shake, cracks appearing on the rotten wood. Sarah cried out, Tom screamed in despair, and Mr. Miller just sat motionless, muttering, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." John understood that forgiveness would never come, because these souls were too hurt to let go. In a moment of panic, the flashlight in John's hand suddenly shone straight into the corner of the room. All three were stunned when they saw a charred child sitting curled up, staring blankly. It opened its mouth, its voice hoarse, whispering, "You must have seen what we saw." Immediately after, black smoke billowed out, engulfing the entire room. John felt his body being pulled into an endless void. The surrounding scenery spun around, then stopped in the scene of a wooden house burning fiercely. The screams of dozens of children echoed, the sound of the door being locked, the desperate cries for help. John shouted for Tom and Sarah, but both were also immersed in this nightmare. The group realized that they had just been dragged into the memories of the souls who had died in the fire in the past. The fire was bright. The heat was burning. The thick smoke made the three of them cough and choke. They ran through the hallway, saw each child crying desperately, their small hands pounding on the windows, but no one saved them. The scene made Sarah collapse, Tom choke, and John shed tears. This was the buried truth. This was the resentment that turned the souls faceless. A burned child approached John, reaching out a trembling hand to touch his hand. In that moment, he clearly felt the pain and despair. The child whispered, "Free us." Then the scene disappeared. The three of them returned to the room. Sweat and tears mixed together, hearts pounding. The door of the room rang with more bangs, as if about to break open. John understood that the spirits not only wanted revenge, but also yearned for release. But how to end this curse was still an unanswered question. The story did not end there, because the next night would be when John and his friends would have to face the choice of life and death directly. The room was filled with the smell of smoke and ashes, even though the fire was only a memory left by the spirit. John sat down on the floor, breathing heavily, his head still echoing with the sound of a miserable cry. Tom squeezed his shoulder tightly, but his own eyes were filled with tears. Sarah held her head, shaking it repeatedly as if to dispel the creepy sounds. Mr. Miller was silent, his old face immersed in darkness, his eyes lifeless and full of guilt. John understood that the spirits did not just want to scare him, but wanted someone to tell the truth, wanted someone to witness their pain. But how could he free them when the resentment had eaten deep into this land? Outside, the knocking on the door sounded again, stronger, like dozens of arms were tapping on rotten wood. Each sound made the floor shake. The flashlight on the table flickered as if it was about to go out. Sarah trembled, saying that she heard children's voices in her head, calling her name, asking for help. Tom turned to John, his eyes determined, saying that they had to find something connected to the soul, something that had been buried in the fire. John nodded, remembering the strange signs around the warehouse and the lake. Perhaps there was a secret hidden there. Mr. Miller suddenly exclaimed, his voice trembling, that on the night of the fire, some children had been locked in the underground cellar under the warehouse. He had never dared to go back there because of the guilt that had haunted him for the rest of his life. The statement stunned the group, horror spreading throughout the room. John clenched his fists, knowing that if they wanted to survive, they had to return to that dark place, face the truth. The wind howled outside the window, followed by a series of faceless shadows appearing in the lightning. They did not just stand still, but crawled on the ground, their long arms groping as if they wanted to reach someone. Sarah fell back on the floor, screaming. Tom pulled her up, and John quickly grabbed the flashlight and shone it outside. In the flickering light, he clearly saw an old wooden door next to the warehouse, which seemed to lead underground. John knew that this was the entrance to the underground bunker that Mr. Miller had just mentioned. But to get there, they had to cross the courtyard full of faceless spirits. Fear gripped every beat of his heart, but also urged John to act immediately. Before it was too late, the door to the room cracked again. Pieces of wood fell. The group understood that they could not hold out any longer. Tom raised his stick. John held the flashlight tightly. Sarah struggled to stand. Mr. Miller staggered after him, his eyes filled with tears. They prepared to step out, face the vengeful spirits, to find a way down to the underground bunker. The story was not over, because the next night would open the door to the end of the horror in the haunted summer camp. The door finally burst open under the pounding. Cold wind and darkness rushed in, carrying with it the sound of wailing. John, Tom, and Sarah rushed out in a panic, Mr. Miller limping behind. Before them, the rain-soaked courtyard turned into a sea of faceless people. Dozens of souls silently tilting their heads to watch. Lightning flashed, revealing a path leading straight to the warehouse, where the underground vault door was half-dash submerged. John took a deep breath, tightened his grip on the flashlight, and shouted, "If you want to pay, we will face you." Tom and Sarah followed closely, their legs shaking but still moving forward. They dashed across the courtyard, the flashlight beam sweeping back and forth, each time it lit up. They saw long hands reaching out to pull them back. Sarah screamed, but Tom swung his stick to ward off something cold and invisible. When they reached the vault door, they realized it was locked with an old, rusty iron padlock. Mr. Miller stepped forward shakily, took out a rusty key hidden in his coat. He whispered that he had kept it for decades, but had never dared to open it. His hand trembled, the key rattled in the lock. Then the wooden door creaked open. The pungent smell of mold rushed straight into the faces, making the group suffocate. Below was a rotten wooden staircase leading down into the pitch darkness. The flashlight's light only illuminated a few steps. The distance was immersed in thick darkness. Cold winds blew up from the basement, carrying vague whispers and mournful sobs. Sarah held John's hand tightly, begging him not to go down, but John knew they had no other choice. The group walked down step by step, the wooden planks creaking under their feet like wailing. The narrow space made their rapid breathing echo. When they reached the bottom, they saw a dark underground room, mossy stone walls, on which were still burnt and stained handprints. The lingering smell of smoke had never dissipated. Suddenly, the flashlight revealed rusty iron beds stacked close together. On them, blurry figures began to appear, each child burned, eyes hollow, body deformed. A miserable cry echoed throughout the cellar, causing Sarah to scream, Tom to retreat and hit the wall, and John to almost suffocate. Mr. Miller fell to his knees, holding his head in his hands, sobbing, "Please forgive me." But the faceless children did not respond. They turned their heads in unison, moving jerkily, then slowly approached. The flashlight in John's hand flickered, the light reflecting their pitch-black eyes as deep as an abyss. A ghostly laugh rang out, mixed with the crying, creating a creepy melody that drowned out the sound of their heartbeats. John knew that tonight, they were not just facing memories, but real judgment. And once the cellar door was opened, there was no turning back. The story is not over yet, because the next night will reveal the ultimate secret in the cellar and the fate of those who dare to enter. The air in the underground bunker was thick. The smell of smoke and mold rushed straight into the lungs, making the group suffocate. John shined the flashlight into the corner of the wall. the burnt marks still imprinted, like evidence of a tragedy that had never faded. Sarah held his arm tightly, trembling, her eyes filled with tears. Tom stood in front, the wooden stick shaking in his hand, and Mr. Miller knelt down, apologizing over and over again. The cries of children echoed, mixed with the groans of the souls trapped here. The faceless shadows began to surround, their heads tilted, moving jerkily, each step closer. The flashlight in John's hand flickered, clearly illuminating a face without eyes, without mouth, but exuding extreme resentment. Sarah screamed, and Tom rushed forward, swinging his stick into the air, but it only penetrated the blurry shapes. Suddenly, a stream of black smoke wrapped around Tom's neck, pulling him down onto the cold stone floor. John rushed forward, but the cold feeling penetrated his bones, making him almost freeze. In his panic, the flashlight suddenly shone on a rusty iron box buried under a pile of rotten wood. John immediately realized that it was no ordinary object. When he touched it, the faceless figures stopped, as if held by some force. John trembled and pulled the box out, dust and ashes falling everywhere. Sarah and Tom stared, and Mr. Miller burst into tears, exclaiming that it was something he had been hiding. The box opened, and inside were small relics, a few burned buttons, a doll with half a face missing, and a soaked diary, the words blurred. When John turned the pages, the last lines appeared. They locked us in. We can't breathe. The fire is coming. Who will remember us? John's heart clenched, his eyes blurred with tears. The faceless figure moved closer, but no longer madly angry. They stood still, their black eye sockets staring into the diary. Sarah trembled as she understood. These souls wanted to be heard, wanted the truth to be told. John clutched the notebook, his voice choked but determined. He promised to tell everything, would not let them be forgotten again. A cold wind blew through. The faceless figure paused, then slowly retreated into the darkness. The cellar was filled with heavy silence, only the sound of panting and rapid heartbeat. Tom struggled to sit up. Sarah was still sobbing, and Mr. Miller was face down, tears mixed with sweat. But John knew this was only the beginning, because holding that diary in their hands also meant that they had become the ones responsible for the restless souls. Outside, thunder rumbled, signaling the approach of another night. And the next night would be when they would face the final judgment from the ghosts of the haunted summer camp. The cellar was quiet again after the faceless figures withdrew, but the atmosphere was still thick with haunting. John hugged the diary tightly, feeling it radiate a chill that penetrated his bones. Sarah sank to the stone floor, her eyes staring blankly into the darkness, while Tom tried to reassure her, but his voice was trembling. Mr. Miller stood against the wall, his face haggard, his eyes filled with regret and fear. John flipped through a few more pages, the shaky writing appearing like a final cry for help. There was a passage that recorded that the children tried to break the door, begging the adults to return, but to no avail. The lines stopped abruptly, the ink smudged by fire and tears. Each word was like a knife cutting into the mind, leaving the group silent in despair. Sarah burst into tears, hugging John, muttering, "They didn't deserve to die like that." The whisper suddenly rang out, not far away this time, but right in the heads of all three. A child's voice called out, repeating the same phrase, "Don't let us forget." John felt his head spinning, his vision blurring. Tom quickly held his shoulder, but he heard the voice too. Sarah was panicking, covering her ears, but couldn't stop the echo. Mr. Miller finally spoke, his voice choked. He admitted that the summer camp had been rebuilt to cover up the tragedy, to bury the terrible memories. The adults had remained silent, pretending that the fire had never happened. And now, it was that lie that had turned this place into a cursed land. John stood up, his eyes determined. He said that if the spirits just needed to be recognized, remembered, they had to find a way to tell the truth to the outside world. But Sarah was frightened, thinking that spirits would never let go easily. Tom was half believing, but John's fierce gaze made him nod at that moment. The cellar door shook violently, as if dozens of invisible hands were pounding on it. The flashlight beam quickly swept across the wall, revealing new words written in wet mud. "We cannot leave alone." Sarah screamed, and John trembled. The spirits not only wanted the truth to be revealed, but also wanted someone to accompany them to the end of their unfinished journey. Footsteps echoed above, hurried and heavy. Something was waiting for them outside the cellar, something more than a faceless shadow. John clutched the diary, knowing that the next confrontation would decide everything. The story was not over, because the coming night would force them to choose between survival and bearing the resentment of the spirits. The space in the underground bunkers shook as if an invisible force wanted to swallow everything. John hugged the diary tightly, his eyes tensely looking towards the wooden stairs leading up. The footsteps above became clearer, urgent, heavy, as if dozens of people were moving at the same time. Sarah trembled, tears rolling down, her mouth stammering, begging not to go out. Tom took a deep breath, the stick in his hand shaking but still firmly standing in front. Mr. Miller sat down on the stone floor, his eyes lifeless, whispering that the final judgment moment had come. Suddenly, the flashlight in John's hand went out. Darkness enveloped the entire bunker. A hoarse laugh rang out, echoing from all directions. In the brief moment when lightning flashed from the crack in the door above, John clearly saw the faceless shadows crowding around the exit, their heads tilted, their deep eye sockets as if wanting to drag the group into eternal darkness. Sarah cried out, clinging to John, while Tom shouted, banging his stick on the stone floor as if to fight off the nightmare. Suddenly, new words appeared in the diary, though the paper had long been burned. The words were shaky, written in blood, blurred, but still clear. "Who will bear the burden for us?" John was stunned, his hands shaking. He felt an invisible pressure pressing down on his shoulders, as if forcing him to become the one to bear the curse. Sarah screamed, telling him to throw the book away. But John couldn't. A mysterious force tied him to it. The air in the cellar was thick. The cold air wrapped around his throat. Children's voices rang out, this time no longer crying but high-pitched, distorted laughter. Tom covered his ears, his eyes bloodshot, but the voice still echoed in his head. "Stay with us." Suddenly, the charred shapes of children rushed out of the darkness, rushing straight towards the group. Sarah screamed, collapsed. Tom hugged her, and John clutched the diary, his eyes blazing. He screamed that he would tell the truth, that he would bring their story to light. In that moment, the spirits stopped, surrounding them in a circle. The laughter stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. Mr. Miller cried out, covered his face, admitted his guilt, and begged for forgiveness. But instead of retreating, the faceless figure slowly approached, as if to drag him away. John understood that tonight there would be a trade-off. A life would have to leave to pay for what had been buried, and if not, all would be engulfed in darkness. The story did not end. because the next night would reveal who would bear the curse of the haunted summer camp spirits. The air in the cellar was so heavy that every breath seemed to drain his strength. John held the diary tightly, his eyes red, the distorted laughter of children still echoing in his head. Sarah sat trembling in Tom's arms, her pale lips unable to speak. Mr. Miller knelt, his hands gripping the cold stone floor, tears mingling with sobs. Faceless shadows surrounded him, heads tilted, empty eye sockets staring intently at him as if waiting for a judgment. Suddenly, one of the faceless shadows separated, slowly walking towards John. It bent down, its burned hands reaching for the diary. John felt his whole body go cold, as if a dark wind had pierced through it. He hesitated, then slowly raised the notebook. The light from the pages suddenly flared, illuminating the dark cellar. In that moment, the images of the children appeared, their faces distorted in the fire. Their eyes panicked, their mouths calling for help. The sight made Sarah cry, Tom was stunned, and John almost collapsed. A voice rang out, childish but resounding throughout the cellar. Who will replace us? John was speechless, his heart pounding. He turned to look at Mr. Miller, saw him trembling, his eyes filled with tears. Mr. Miller screamed that he was the one who deserved to pay, that this sin he would carry for the rest of his life. But as soon as he spoke, the faceless shadows rushed forward, wrapping tightly around his body. Sarah screamed, Tom pulled her back, and John stood still. Watching the horrifying scene, Mr. Miller was pulled to the floor. The shadows crawled over him, squeezing as if to dissolve him into the darkness. He screamed in pain, but also smiled through his tears. Finally, the time has come. Light flashed from the diary, then exploded like an underground fire. When the light faded, Mr. Miller's body disappeared, leaving only a cold void. The faceless shadows stopped, slowly retreated, but did not disappear. John clenched the diary, feeling it burn in his hand. The words appeared again, written in fresh blood. One is not enough. They need more. His heart stopped, sweat poured down his body. Sarah collapsed. Tom screamed in protest, but John knew that Mr. Miller's sacrifice was only the beginning. The souls had not been freed. The twisted laughter echoed through the cellar again, this time more violent, more terrifying. The flickering flashlight beam revealed hands reaching out from the stone walls, as if to drag the group into the darkness. John took a breath, his eyes determined. If they did not find a way, they would be next. The story was not over, because the next night would be when the souls would begin to choose who would be the next victims to bear the curse. The underground space was empty after Mr. Miller disappeared, but the cold was getting deeper and deeper into the marrow. John hugged the burned diary close to his chest, eyes wide with fear and determination. Sarah sat down, her face pale, her lips moving as if she had no more strength to scream. Tom looked around, his hand tightening on the wooden stick, but deep down he knew it could do nothing against the faceless spirits. From the damp walls, charred hands continued to crawl out, groping in the air. John swung the flashlight, the light reflecting the distorted silhouettes of children from the past, their bodies burned and blotchy, their eyes hollow like deep pits. Children's laughter echoed everywhere, sometimes near, sometimes far, turning the entire basement into a ghostly stage. Sarah covered her face, sobbing, and Tom screamed angrily, "What do you want from us?" At that moment, the diary shook in John's hand, the red words appearing. 1 life is not enough. More is needed. All three were stunned, their hearts pounding as if they were about to burst. John clenched the notebook, shouting that they could not continue to pay with their lives, that there must be another way to escape. But his words only made the faceless shadows tilt their heads, then burst into creepy laughter. Sarah suddenly fainted, her body cold. Tom hugged her, calling her name in despair. John rushed forward, shining the flashlight, and realized that the shadows of children were clinging to Sarah, as if trying to drag her soul away. He screamed, swinging his hand to hit them with the light. The flashlight flashed, the shadows temporarily disappeared, but Sarah was still unconscious, her breathing weak. John trembled, tears welled up, afraid that she would become the next victim. In a moment of despair, Tom looked at John, his eyes burning. He said that if it took another person to free the soul, he was ready. John was stunned, screaming that it was not allowed. But Tom gritted his teeth, looked into the darkness that was thickening around them, and said softly, "At least, if I go, maybe Sarah and you will survive." The words made John choke with pain. He squeezed his friend's hand, screaming that he would not let anyone else die. But the diary glowed again. The words appeared, "The choice has come." The sound of hurried footsteps echoed on the wooden stairs again. The faceless shadow stepped down, surrounding them tightly. John knew that they could not delay any longer, because tonight would decide who would have to bear the cursed fate. The cellar seemed to shrink by the second, the cold air filling it, making it impossible for anyone to feel their breath. John held the diary tightly, his hands numb from the invisible weight. Sarah was still lying unconscious in Tom's arms, her face pale as if half her soul had been taken away. Tom looked at John, his eyes burning in the darkness, repeating his determination. "If you need someone, let me replace you." John shook his head frantically, his voice hoarse from screaming. No one else is allowed to die. Faceless shadows surrounded them, heads tilted, jerking, distorted laughter echoing all around. The cellar walls began to crack, pieces of stone falling down, revealing charred hands groping as if they wanted to touch them. John shined his flashlight everywhere, the shaky light shining on the distorted faces, the black eye sockets boring straight into him. His heart was pounding like a drum, but a thought flashed through his mind. Maybe they didn't need a life. But a promise kept. John opened the diary, shouting that he would bring the truth to light, would let everyone know about the souls who died unjustly here. His words echoed throughout the cellar, as if tearing apart the suffocating silence. The faceless shadows paused, no longer rushing forward. A charred child appeared more clearly, stepping closer to John. It raised its trembling hand to touch the notebook, its empty eye sockets but shining with a strange light. Sarah gasped. Her eyes opened slightly, as if pulled back from the edge of death. Tom hugged her tightly, his shoulders shaking but his eyes fixed on John. Everyone was tense, waiting for the reaction of the souls. But immediately after, the diary lit up again. New words written in blood appeared. Promises are not enough. Proof is needed. The faceless shadows screamed in unison. The ear-piercing screams made the entire cellar shake. Sarah screamed. Tom pulled her close, and John was almost paralyzed by the terrible pressure. He knew that to escape this place, they would have to do more than make promises. They would have to face the past with real action. Suddenly, the cellar door swung open, a cold wind blowing in, carrying the pungent smell of smoke. From outside, lightning flashed, revealing faceless figures, heads tilted, ready to rush in. John clutched the diary, his eyes burning with despair. He knew that the coming night would force them to prove themselves through sacrifice or some unthinkable act. The cellar resounded with a scream that tore through the air, and each section of the stone wall shook as if it were about to collapse. John held the diary tightly, his hands trembling but his eyes determined. Sarah gradually regained consciousness, but her body was weak, her breathing was rapid, her eyes filled with tears as she looked around with utter panic. Tom was still standing in front, his hands tightly gripping the stick, his proud eyes as if ready to sacrifice himself at any moment. The faceless shadows gathered closer. Each jerky movement echoed with the sound of bones cracking, creating a terrifying sound. A charred child stepped out of the circle, walking straight towards John. He placed his charred hand on the diary. Immediately, a ghostly fire flared up around the cellar, not hot but burning in his mind. Everyone saw the scene replayed, the wooden house on fire, the sound of children crying, the sound of the door being locked from the outside. These images were no longer illusions, but vivid memories, forcing them to witness them with their own eyes. John choked, tears streaming down his face. Sarah fell to her knees, covering her face, not daring to look. Tom bit his lip until it bled, but forced himself to stand still. The diary again showed the words in blood. "What will you do for us?" The question echoed like thunder in all three of their minds. John shouted that he would tell, would engrave each child's name into history. But the faceless figure did not budge. Sarah trembled as she said that they could do nothing while they were still imprisoned here. As soon as she finished speaking, the wall of the cellar behind them cracked open, revealing a long corridor leading out into the woods. But the path was filled with crawling shadows, hands reaching out to beckon. Tom looked at John, his eyes burning. "This is the only chance. If you want to prove it, you have to go into the place where the spirit resides." John took a deep breath, holding the diary tightly, the dim light radiating from it illuminating the narrow path. Sarah choked, trying to stand up, grabbing John's hand. Tom banged his stick on the ground and shouted, "If anyone has to pay, choose me." But John shook his head and pulled them both along. He understood that proving was not about sacrificing a life, but about facing the ultimate truth. The first footsteps echoed in the dark corridor, surrounded by ghostly laughter, mixed with the wailing of a child. The cold air wrapped around their necks, the heavy smell of smoke, as if leading the three of them deeper into the nightmare. John knew that tonight they would go to the heart of the secret, where the soul awaited the final judgment. The damp stone corridor stretched on endlessly, the sound of footsteps echoing and mixing with the sobbing of the souls of children. John walked in the lead, his hand tightly gripping the diary that emitted a faint light, clearly illuminating the burnt marks on the wall as if carved by the old fire. Sarah clung to his arm, her body trembling, her lips moving in unconscious prayer. Tom walked behind, a wooden stick in hand, his eyes staring into the thick darkness as if afraid that anything would rush out. Black smoke swirled in the air, forming faces that appeared and disappeared. The children's laughter echoed, distorted as if torn apart. Sarah panicked, holding her head and crying, and John could only pull her forward. Tom gritted his teeth and shouted into the void, "What else do you want?" Before he finished speaking, a series of burnt hands reached out from both sides of the wall, grabbing their shoulders. John quickly raised the diary high. The light flashed, the hands retracted, leaving behind a strong smell of smoke. The hallway opened into a large room, high-ceilinged, dimly lit by dozens of red burning candles. The walls were covered with half-burned dolls, their heads tilted, their eyes vacant. Sarah screamed, collapsing when she saw a doll that looked exactly like her childhood toy, now charred but still smelling of smoke. Tom clenched his staff, his face pale, in the middle of the room. A circle of ash appeared, where dozens of faceless souls gathered. They tilted their heads in unison, their black eye sockets fixed on the three people. John stepped forward, holding up the diary and shouting that they had seen, understood, and had brought this memory to tell. But the notebook showed a line of blood. It's not just a memory. You must feel it. Instantly, invisible flames erupted around the three of them. Sarah screamed, Tom hugged her, and John was engulfed in flames that did not burn his flesh, but burned his mind. In his eyes, the scene of the fire from back then appeared again, but this time he not only saw, but also heard, and clearly felt the suffocation, the heart-wrenching pain. The children cried for help. The sound of doors being locked, the sound of wood cracking, and the smell of burning flesh permeated the air. John screamed, his whole body trembling, tears flowing uncontrollably. Sarah fainted in Tom's arms, and Tom bit his lips, his eyes bloodshot, forcing himself to stand firm. The diary glowed brightly, then the words in blood appeared again. When you feel enough pain, we will rest in peace. The faceless figures retreated, silently observing. The atmosphere was thick, only the erratic heartbeats of three small people facing the eternal darkness remained. The fire of memory in the doll room gradually died out, leaving ashes and thick darkness. John knelt in the middle of the circle, the burnt diary still emitting a faint red light like embers. Sarah gradually regained consciousness in Tom's arms, her eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling, begging not to go on. Tom squeezed John's hand tightly, his voice hoarse but determined. We have come this far, we must go to the end. Otherwise, we will all be trapped forever. The faceless figures stood in a circle around, silently tilting their heads, their black eye sockets, as if trying to suck out their souls. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and blood. The whispers of children echoed, sometimes near, sometimes far. On the wall, the half-burned dolls suddenly opened their eyes, their empty gazes fixed on the three people. Sarah screamed loudly, while Tom gripped his stick tightly, his eyes blazing but his legs trembling slightly. Suddenly, the diary in John's hand lit up again. Lines of blood appeared. To prove it, you must go through the last door. The light from the window shone directly on the opposite wall, where a huge black stone door slowly appeared, towering, its surface carved with distorted characters. The sound of wind howled from the crack in the door, carrying the smell of ashes and the sound of mournful crying. John stood up, walking step by step towards the door. Sarah held his hand tightly, crying and begging him not to go. Tom followed closely behind, hoarsely. If this is the only way, we must accept it. The door shook, emitting a strange heartbeat like buzzing sound. When John placed his hand on it, the whole room shook. The faceless shadows screamed in unison, the screams so loud that Sarah fell to her knees. The door slowly opened, crimson light pouring out, illuminating a path straight down into the deep underground. Children's voices echoed in all three of their heads. Go on, or stay with us forever. John's heart pounded as if it were about to burst, but he knew there was no way back. The diary shook violently in his hand, as if urging him to go to the end. Tom put his arm around John's shoulder, his eyes filled with determination, while Sarah wiped away her tears, struggling to stand despite her trembling legs. The three of them looked at each other for a moment, then stepped forward, ready to enter the door of fate. The faceless shadows retreated, forming an open corridor. But in that silence, the eerie, bone-chilling laughter still echoed. The giant stone door slowly opened, revealing a red tunnel like the heart of a furnace. John took a deep breath, hugging the diary tightly to his chest, his eyes determined. Sarah trembled and clung to his arm, her eyes filled with tears of fear, while Tom followed behind, the wooden stick in his hand shaking, but his proud gaze as if ready to fight to the last breath. As the three of them entered, the door slammed shut behind them, the echoing sound making their hearts tighten. The tunnel led to a large space. In the middle was a raging black fire, not radiating heat but burning the mind. Around, hundreds of faceless shadows stood crowded together, their heads tilted in unison, their black eye sockets fixed on three small people. The sounds of children crying, laughing and screaming mixed together, creating a terrifying sound that made Sarah clutch her head and collapse. The black fire suddenly surged, from which appeared a giant figure, a distorted combination of dozens of children's souls. It bowed its head, the children's voices echoing in unison. "Do you dare bear this pain?" John trembled but took a step forward, holding the diary high. He shouted that the truth would never be buried again, that the names of the souls would be engraved forever. The black fire shook, then exploded in a blinding light. John felt hundreds of screams echoing in his head, each heart-wrenching pain coming. Sarah cried out, Tom held her, and John collapsed, but still clutched the diary. The last words appeared, glowing red with blood. "We are remembered." The faceless figures faded into ash. The black fire also went out, leaving absolute silence. The cellar shook violently and collapsed. The three of them rushed out in despair. When they fell to the cold, damp ground of the forest, the first light of dawn broke. There were no more ghosts, no more laughter and tears, only the wind blowing through the trees. Sarah hugged John and Tom tightly, tears streaming down her face, whispering, "We survived." John opened the diary for the last time. The pages were blank, save for a few burnt marks. He knew the last souls had been freed, and the truth would live forever in their memories. But deep in John's eyes, there was still a haunting light. That memory would follow them to the end of their lives.